morning, good afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are. Welcome to the second day of the OASPA annual conference. My name is Leslie Chan. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Global Development Studies and the director of BioLine International and the Knowledge Equity Lab at the University of Toronto, Scarborough. It's a great pleasure for me to chair the session this morning and to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Jennifer Wemigwans. But before I introduce my colleague, I would like to say a couple of words about the conference. For the last couple of years, I've served on this conference committee, and I've been very, very impressed with the leadership of the OASPA organization and the planning process and the thoughts and consideration put into the conferences, the planning itself. So I'd like to particularly thank Claire and of course to Bernie, who oversees every aspect of this conference. Without Bernie's constant oversight, I think a lot of things may not go as smoothly as it has been. So thank you very much for their leadership. And I also want to applaud the decisions to keep this a virtual conference, because I know many conferences have rushed back to meeting in person and forgotten about the many barriers and inequities that are built into international conferences. So by keeping this conference virtual, we know there are limitations, but there are also many possibilities and spaces being opened up. And I think it is particularly appropriate in the context of the upcoming keynotes that you'll be hearing. And some of you who attended the opening session yesterday will remember Anasuya Sengupta's reminder that when we think about open access, we shouldn't be just thinking about the how, but we have to remind ourselves about who knowledge really matters, whose knowledge are being open, by whom, and for whom. The how is important, but these other consideration has to take precedent over the how, and in conjunction with the how itself. And you'll hear some of that today from Dr. Wemigwans. Dr. Wemigwans' talk title is called Digital Bundles, Creating a New Space for Indigenous Knowledge that Moves Beyond Open Access Publishing. Jennifer Wemigwans is from the Wemigwans unceded territory on Manitoula Island, Ontario, Canada. For those of you who've never been to that part of Canada, I urge you to visit. It's a beautiful part of the world, a very unique landscape, and of course, culture. Jennifer is a new media producer, writer, and scholar specializing in the convergence between education, Indigenous knowledge, and new media technologies. Her book, A Digital Bundle, Protecting and Promoting Indigenous Knowledge Online, was published in 2018, and it explores the prospects of Indigenous knowledge education and digital projects in a networked world. Dr. Wemigwans takes pride in working to invert the conventional use of media by revealing the potential for Indigenous cultural expression and Indigenous knowledge through new technologies, education, and the arts. She's an assistant professor in the adult education and community development program at OISE, University of Toronto. So I'm very proud to have her as a colleague. Currently, Dr. Wemigwans is working on a project looking at the cultural ethics of care and Indigenous protocols of creation. These practices signify digital bundles as a new space for sharing Indigenous knowledge and challenge non-Indigenous audiences' understanding of online genres, copyright practices, and the transfer of knowledge in new forms. So as you can see, this is very appropriate in the context of this conference. So without further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Wemigwans to take the virtual floor, and she'll be speaking for about 20 minutes or so, and hopefully we'll have some interactive Q&A, and then we will then have concluding remarks. Thank you so much. Jennifer, please.
Okay, miigwech, thank you, Dr. Chan and OASPA for the invitation to share my work with you today. So I'm just going to share my screen to bring up a slide presentation. All right, let's see if we can just. Okay, how's that? Good? Okay. All right, so historically, Indigenous knowledge was not recognized or acknowledged by colonial settlers who were intent on occupying and taking Indigenous land. Today, not much has changed, as many non-Indigenous peoples have no idea what constitutes Indigenous knowledge. Ongoing erasure of Indigenous knowledge has resulted in mainstream educators, policymakers, government bodies, and citizens in general needing to be educated on the importance of Indigenous knowledge and what it constitutes, as they currently have no reference point for it and remain unaware. And while some may be interested in learning, many others want to facilitate ignorance and erasure in order to continue occupying and taking Indigenous land. It is for this reason that the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People stated in 2008 that Indigenous peoples have the right to revitalize, use, develop, and transmit to future generations their histories, languages, and oral traditions, philosophies, writing systems, and literatures, and to designate and retain their own names for community, places, and persons. In reading Resurgence and Reconciliation, Indigenous Settler Relations and Earth Teachings, edited by Michael Ash, John Burroughs, and James Tully, I appreciated the question being put forward of what are genuinely, if I can say that word, what are genuinely self-determining practices of resurgence and transformative forms of reconciliation today? And how are they distinguished from non-robust and non-transformative practices and reconciliation? Burroughs and Tully state in the introduction that this is not a theoretical question, but a practical one. Which brings me to my work on using digital technologies to promote and protect Indigenous knowledge. So in thinking about beyond open access publishing, I'm going to take a deep dive into the concept of a digital bundle and what it means and the kind of space it creates online and how it functions as a place for Indigenous knowledge transference. So I guess to begin, I will share a brief introduction to an Indigenous knowledge site that I produced and launched in 2006. So I'm going to play this video. If you, for some reason, you can't hear the audio, please do let me know. And this is about a minute long.
The American continents have been called the New World, but our histories as the original peoples of these lands tell us we have always been here, that we belong to these places which are sacred to us. Our collective memories go far back beyond what the modern world considers history. We have shared these continents in all the four directions for many thousands of years. To us, this is the old world, and there have been many nations here through the ages. Each of our nations has always had their own ways of life, with distinct beliefs and languages, economic, political, and social systems, and medicinal, ecological, and other forms of knowledge. Every one of these nations has its own way to recognize its place in the greater hoop that we're all part of. And all our diverse forms of knowledge lead back to that common circle. Through our various traditions, we recognize that everything in the universe is connected, that everything has being and deserves respect. We never worship the sun or animals or other forms of nature as gods, but we recognize that these things are symbols of mysteries that cannot be explained in words, and that they all lead back to the greatest mystery of all, the source of all creation. So through our stories and songs, we have always recognized the same ultimate creative force. Some of our elders still remember and maintain the foundations of our original knowledge. We believe that these forms of knowledge can help address urgent matters for the world today. Here we share a few teachings of elders from some of the original nations of North America, the Mi'kmaq of the Atlantic region, the Mohawk, or Haudenosaunee of southern Quebec and Ontario and upper New York State, the Ojibwe, or Anishinaabeg of the Great Lakes region, the Cree, or Nahiwak of the Canadian prairies and woodlands, and the Piikani Blackfoot of southern Alberta and northern Montana. Welcome to the Four Directions Interactive Teachings.
Okay, so Four Directions Teachings was designed to celebrate Indigenous knowledge by honoring the process of listening with intent to the teachings of elders and traditional teachers from 5 distinct Indigenous nations. Specifically, they are Tom Porter, Mohawk, Mary Lee, Cree, Stephen Augustine, Mi'kmaq, Lillian Pitawanakwat Ba, Anishinaabe, Reg Crowshoe, and Jeff Crow Eagle, Blackfoot. It is significant to note that each elder and knowledge keeper is featured prominently on the site. Their individual biographies are positioned with their teachings, which avoids a pan-Indian approach and speaks to Indigenous methodology of location. That is, the biography locates each elder and knowledge keeper within their community, which conveys to the visitor how they have become or are acknowledged and accepted as an elder. Further, this approach demonstrates that the teachings and knowledge shared are not generic, but are in fact a specific teaching from an acknowledged and valued cultural teacher. That is a person who is recognized as having the cultural protocol to share that teaching. For example, Stephen Augustine's bio states that he is a hereditary chief, and Tom Porter's bio points to his early activism with Indigenous knowledge keepers. Within Indigenous epistemologies, the teachings of the Four Directions are central and key to philosophical understandings of the universe and human beings' roles and responsibilities. Indigenous visitors to the site are able to read the relationships of the Four Directions and understand that the direction and placement of each quadrant has significant meaning for each teaching. Non-Indigenous visitors to the site don't recognize that the stories being shared are teachings. They don't recognize the importance of the interface design and how the circle represents a holistic model that is rooted in the teachings of the Four Directions. They seem unable to grasp that part of the teaching is the interface design that shows the relationship of each direction and hence the impact and flow of relationality from each of the Four Directions. Non-Indigenous reception of the site seems completely unable to grasp that it is not linear, it is not text-based, it is relational. So the circle, the medicine wheel, the teepee, they are signifiers. In fact, we could say that they are cultural signifiers that are particular to diverse Indigenous nations and to the elders and knowledge keepers that teach them. And just as Western people have talked about theory and signifiers, so do Indigenous people, but we have our own set of signifiers and our own set of theories and models as demonstrated and presented on fourdirectionsteachings.com. A digital bundle is a new cultural signifier. It is a new offering online that distinguishes itself from new media art, digital storytelling, and information. In fact, a digital bundle is a new social movement online as it challenges existing dominant social configurations of power by contributing to social and political transformation from the periphery of what Sandy Grande calls white stream society. Digital bundles online help to revive and assert Indigenous knowledge. To better articulate, I turn to the work of Leah A. Livro, whose book, Alternative and Activist New Media, inspired me to recognize that Indigenous knowledge online is itself a contemporary, alternative, and activist new media project. I came upon this work while searching for ways to frame my analysis of Indigenous knowledge online. I was particularly struck by her discussion of 5 basic genres of contemporary, alternative, and activist new media projects, which I've listed here: culture jamming, alternative computing, participatory journalism, mediated mobilization, and commons knowledge. For Livro, the goal of culture jamming is to borrow, subvert, and comment on popular culture. Alternative computing involves highly specialized programmers who develop open software or hack into existing software to modify it for public purposes. Participatory journalism is reporting from the margins that aims to subvert mainstream and media broadcast of the news, and mediated mobilization extends and activates the power of live, local social relations and organizing, such as kinship and social support networks, professional affiliation, or expert advice networks. And finally, the Commons Knowledge Project challenges or reframe the established expert knowledge classifications of mainstream cultural institutions and disciplines. These 5 online genres, according to Livro, quote, do not only reflect or critique mainstream media and culture, they constitute and intervene in them, unquote. Desperate to find where and how 4directionsteachings.com might fit into this array of alternative new media, I reviewed each genre carefully. However, I concluded that none really fits how 4directionsteachings.com was conceived or how it works. And although aspects of mediated mobilization and commons knowledge projects could be used to describe the work of 4directionsteachings.com, that would be like trying to fit a square block into a round hole. For example, according to Livro, mediated mobilization, quote, relates to the domain of political and cultural organizing and social movements, unquote. She further explains that it takes advantage of web-based social software tools like network sites, personal blogs, flash mobs, and email listservs, as well as do-it-yourself digital media to cultivate interpersonal networks online and to mobilize those networks to engage in live and mediated collective action. The Idle No More movement and Indigenous protest movement might be described in these terms, because it used Facebook, personal blogs, it used websites and listservs to mobilize community flash round dances in public. 4directionsteachings.com does not facilitate the same kind of public presence in the streets. It has enabled users to act in the sense that they may have requested more materials for online and for offline use. For example, communities that do not have strong internet access have requested offline copies of 4directionsteachings.com content or promotional material to hand out to their communities. More importantly, the project has facilitated connections to elders presented on the site for communities seeking their expertise. Access has been granted to several institutions to utilize the site and the curriculum pieces in their classes. However, the site has contributed somewhat to aspects of mediated mobilization. This term does not really describe its design or its approach. So with respect to the Commons knowledge projects, Livro writes that they, quote, reorganize and categorize information in ways that challenge or reframe the established expert knowledge classifications of mainstream cultural institutions and disciplines. This genre, she expounds, relates to the content of culture itself, the nature of knowledge and expertise, how information is organized and evaluated, who decides. Commons knowledge projects are framed in direct response to established Western knowledge constructs and therefore are seen as radical and subversive of dominant power relations. So for Indigenous communities that have never seen their knowledge appreciated or presented in public spaces, Indigenous knowledge projects online, such as 4directionsteachings.com, are radical and antithetical to the colonial education and textbooks used throughout North America. It could be argued then that 4directionsteachings.com in some ways is a commons knowledge project because of the subversive and alternative position that it occupies. Yet I would posit that this genre is too limiting because it cannot fully acknowledge the depth of the work and the impact of Indigenous knowledge online. To acknowledge this impact, I argue in my book, A Digital Bundle, Protecting and Promoting Indigenous Knowledge Online, that Indigenous knowledge projects online are a unique genre. So while I appreciate Livro's discussion of the 5 basic genres of contemporary alternative and activist new media projects, none is an ideal fit for Indigenous knowledge. However, I am inspired by her thinking about genres and how Livro applies it to activism on the internet. Indeed, it was her writing on the notion of genre that helped me to envision the concept of 4directionsteachings.com as a digital bundle. So here's how she defines genre: a type of expression or communication that is useful and or meaningful among the members of a given community or within a particular situation. Genres have both form and purpose. That is, they have typical material features or follow certain format conventions, and they allow people to express themselves appropriately and to achieve their various purposes or intentions in a given situation. So with this in mind, it's important to understand that the concept of a digital bundle comes from diverse Indigenous knowledge paradigms that recognize that a bundle refers to a collection of things that are regarded as sacred in some way and held by a person with care and ceremony. For example, a bundle could be a wrapping holding an eagle wing or a feather, or containing a rattle, a pipe, or other item used in ceremony, along with medicines like tobacco or dried plants for smudging. Some bundles may be handed down through a family. Other bundles are community bundles that hold a great deal of power, as with very old pipe bundles, some of which may even go back to the beginning of a specific revealed ceremony or tradition that supports the whole community. In this case, the person holding the bundle must undergo a thorough, rigorous process of learning about the meaning or tradition or ceremony and how it gets transferred to the members of the community. For example, Chief Avro Looking Horse of the Lakota, Dakota, Nakota nations is highly regarded when at the age of 12, he received the sacred white buffalo calf pipe bundle and its teachings. Based on these responsibilities, it can be said that a bundle is a lifelong commitment. If not, then the bundle has to be responsibly passed on or otherwise released and never simply neglected or discarded in a disrespectful way. Because 4directionsteachings.com is a collection of teachings by respected elders and traditional teachers who have shared Indigenous knowledge in culturally specific ways, it has been embraced by Indigenous community members as a digital bundle. Hence, this site is a type of expression and communication that is meaningful and recognizable to diverse Indigenous communities. This notion is in keeping with Livro, who also points out that genres may have other significant facets that make them relevant for alternative and activist new media projects. First, she writes, they help mediate or facilitate communication among members of communities. Quoting the work of Kevin Croston and Marie Williams, Livro includes their note that genres are useful because they make communication more easily recognizable and understandable by recipients. Thus, she continues, genres are the means for creating and maintaining community and social contexts and the cultural products of those communities and contexts. Moreover, Livro argues genres can also be so specific to a certain group's worldview or situation that outsiders may not understand them. So genres can also act as boundaries or markers that exclude outsiders and reinforce the power of insiders. Citing Croston and William once more, Livro concludes that recognition of a particular genre is one sign of membership in a particular community. And so with respect to copyright practices, Indigenous communities understand traditional bundles to be representative of traditional cultural expression, which carries cultural protocol and cultural responsibilities. These protocol and responsibilities differ across diverse Indigenous nations. As the statutory review of the Copyright Act report of the Standing Committee on Industry, Science, and Technology recognizes that, quote, in many cases, the Copyright Act fails to meet the expectations of Indigenous peoples with respect to privacy, preservation, and dissemination of their cultural expressions. So in closing, the significance of a digital bundle is that it is a new offering online, a new genre, a new social movement, because it does not fit with existing frameworks online. Indigenous knowledge is a complex epistemological paradigm that embodies ceremonial protocols. Only elders and traditional teachers who have been gifted the Indigenous knowledge and teachings in this way can share those teachings publicly and transfer them. This type of Indigenous knowledge is often considered as belonging to the community and held in trust by knowledge keepers and elders expected to abide by the cultural protocols entrusted to that knowledge. As a producer of Indigenous knowledge media projects and as an academic, I make it part of my practice to articulate this distinction so as not to assume or usurp the role of knowledge keepers or disrespect the Indigenous protocols held by elders who carry the Indigenous knowledge of their communities. In clearly articulating my knowledge as acquired knowledge and in recognizing Indigenous knowledge keepers and elders as representing the Indigenous knowledge protocols of their communities, I am honoring the diverse copyright. That is the protocols, or what John Burroughs, a prominent Indigenous legal scholar, might refer to as the legal traditions of diverse Indigenous nations. Therefore, in thinking about a bundle and what it means, we have to be mindful with the care and passing on of bundles, whether a physical bundle or special bundles of knowledge, or even the gifts we bring forth with us at birth, that these are sacred things and that there is, or at least could be, a ceremony to go along with that process. In this way, our protocols are our copyrights. Our protocols note what is in the commons and what is not. Miigwech.
Thank you, Jennifer, for that very comprehensive and also very, very deep venture into the understanding of Indigenous knowledge and the complexity. And I'm sure you only given us a very good introduction, and I really strongly encourage everyone to look into your book and also to raise questions, which we have time for. So in the remaining 15 minutes, I would encourage you to either use the Q&A section to raise a question, and I think you may have the ability to actually speak. I'm not sure, but I think you could use the Q&A section to raise your question. But while we're waiting for the question, I have a question for you, Jennifer, if you don't mind. So as academics that works in a fairly traditional university, I'm sure you encounter a lot of resistance to the way you're representing Indigenous knowledge and introducing Indigenous knowledge into the academy, because in the academy, as we well know, we have very limited genre as what genres of academic knowledge representation are acceptable, like the traditional books and the journal articles. And your four direction teachings doesn't fit into there, as you said. How is that being received by the academic communities, and how do you educate them in understanding these different ways of representation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question, because I actually, when I was joining OISE, met with the dean and had some meetings around talking about the fact that I do a lot of digital production, and that I wanted this digital production work considered as part of my tenure file, right? And so I think that from the dean's perspective, we have to look at the fact that there's also people who work in the arts, right? So, for example, my colleague Maria Hupfield is a CRC in Indigenous New Media Art, and as an artist, obviously creates art that is shown in art galleries and places like that. And so, you know, that's a different kind of a genre, right? Working in the fine arts, whether it's sculpture or painting, but that also gets recognized as part of their tenure file. So I think that there was this understanding that creating digital Indigenous knowledge projects, I think was definitely a point of negotiation for me coming into OISE and University of Toronto, that they would recognize that, and they did. But I can tell you from my conversations with other universities that they kind of held to the old standard, which was no tenure, we want to see publications in, what do they call, the top tier education journal. And that's when I said, okay, there's not enough flexibility here for me. So yeah, I had to really look at institutions that would be more open to that negotiation process of what counts as production and publication and academic work.
Right. So there is a question being posted on the Q&A, and the question is that I guess we've been having obviously a lot of discussion about open science and open access, essentially saying, you know, we need to open everything and data and publications and so forth. But it sounds from, you know, your lecture that there are tensions here. And so the question is now, how do you address those tensions?
Well, that's what I find so curious, because I think, as I was saying in the kind of talk, that, you know, early on when people would come to Four Directions teachings, because there has been such profound erasure of indigenous knowledge, they don't recognize the site as offering teachings. They see it as folklore. They see it as stories. So it's kind of interesting because it really speaks to the insider-outsider notion. So if you're not actually, you know, able to understand Indigenous knowledge and understand what the cultural signifiers are and symbolism of the knowledge, then it just kind of goes over your head. Whereas Indigenous people who I interviewed for a digital bundle, this had profound meaning for them, that they were able to take the teachings that were offered on there and actually contributed to their own work. Professor John Burroughs, who is at the first, you know, Indigenous legal school in Victoria University, says he often uses Four Directions teachings in his law classes because creation stories and teachings set precedent for law. Right. So he recognizes that, but you talk to somebody off the street and say, hey, have a look at this. And they think it's just charming folk stories, kind of like Hansel and Gretel. It's actually not. There is far more profound. So yeah, so I think there is that tension of the insider-outsider kind of works in our favor, because Indigenous knowledge, we're kind of hidden in plain sight. We can put ourselves, you know, our teachings out there, and unless you are schooled in that, it really doesn't land for you. I hope that kind of answers the question somewhat.
We have a question from Franny Grand, and her question is that about your thoughts on projects like traditional knowledge licenses and platforms like Makutu, which were really designed originally to share Indigenous knowledge. What are your thoughts on these platforms?
Yeah, I really appreciate the work of Kim Kristen. Dr. Kristen's work on Makutu is fabulous, and I see a lot of benefits for those types of platforms. I think that when I look at Makutu, it really is a place that is like a repository for communities to, you know, have their cultural heritage work archived and protected, right? Whereas a digital bundle, with the work I'm doing, it's about having elders and knowledge keepers wanting to offer teachings, and they understand when they offer those teachings, I don't tell them what teaching to share. They decide what teaching they want to share, and that usually then means that they understand that that teaching is going to be for everyone. Like that, you know, when I was first explaining Four Direction teachings to elders and knowledge keepers who weren't familiar with the internet, I would explain to them that this teaching can broadcast out to Mars, right? So what do you feel comfortable sharing? And so it's a bit different in that sense, whereas Merkutu, I really appreciate how there's aspects of the site that are only for, say, people who are from a particular clan, right? Or who are from a particular community, or, you know, that kind of thing. So it's really interesting way to configure and create a repository for Indigenous knowledge in different ways. So more cultural heritage.
Yeah, at the end of your talk, you did refer to the limitation of copyright acts as those from Canadian government, and are things like these traditional licenses and CC Creative Commons license and so forth, are they useful, or what are the limitations as well?
Well, I remember that there was a lot of controversy about that in New Zealand, right? Because they had the Maori trademark for like artisan crafts and different types of like products and pieces that you could purchase and buy from the Maori. And so I don't know what kind of, I haven't followed that so much because it's been a while, but I remember the trademark being at first something that was really celebrated so that it could authenticate that the product you were buying came from the Maori, as opposed to, you know, a factory somewhere else on the other side of the world, right? But yeah, so I think that's a question for artisans, Indigenous artisans, and people who create and sell those kinds of cultural heritage pieces, and then how they feel about, you know, whether that actually protects them or doesn't. Yeah, so I would address that question to someone who's doing that kind of work.
Yeah, great. Lulu Stetter has a question, and her question is, do you have any specific recommendation for non-Indigenous people to try to understand the Indigenous teachings?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of heavy lifting, right? Because we have a colonial education system in place. And so to understand and learn about Indigenous knowledge and teachings, you really have to work hard to seek that out. So it's maybe going to different post-secondary institutions and trying to find people like myself who are teaching, you know, courses on an introduction into Indigenous knowledge. I mean, there's some excellent, there's a website called Strong Nations. I can try to look it up for you, but they have a wonderful site for books on all kinds of topics that actually point out whether the author is Indigenous or not, what it's following, and, you know, whether the graphic artist is Indigenous or not. It's called, yeah, strongnations.com. And maybe that would be a good place to start because there's wonderful books for all kinds of different age sets and grades. And then I also think Oise's Deepening Knowledge website is quite good. And that's a great repository for educators. So one nice thing about Deepening Knowledge and Strong Nations is that both of these sites kind of have done the vetting work for you. So you can be pretty much guaranteed what you're seeing there are good quality resources from Indigenous communities.
Yeah, but thanks for the reminder. There's no quick fix or quick, you know, shortcut to learn about Indigenous knowledge. As you said, is very complex cosmologies of many different traditions, and so there's no like shortcuts to learning. So we do have to put in the work, as you said, seek out the knowledge keepers and the resources, and to learn from people like yourself. So on that note, there's another question, and this is, I guess, broader with regard to, I guess, the ongoing discussion. The UNESCO Open Science Recommendation, UNESCO last year have all the countries sign on to their broad recommendation on open science. Again, there are aspects of it that deal with Indigenous knowledge. I guess the question there is, how do you see the relevance of those recommendations with regard to Indigenous peoples? Are they taking enough consideration in terms of the kind of considerations that you mentioned in your talk?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so if this was something that was released in the past year, then I would have to go and look that up. And so I would thank you for asking that question, because now you've directed me to a resource that I should become more familiar with.
Yeah, in fact, Jennifer, you and I would have a chat, because that was the very question I was going to consult you on.
Okay.
Very good.
Yeah, I'll look into that. Thank you.
Yeah. Then Tom Olioke has a question. Again, he reminds us a lot of traditional knowledge, indigenous knowledge have been ignored, and as you said, also been erased or been appropriated. So how can we take advantage of combining, integrating different knowledge systems to deal with these crises that we face, these existential crises that we face?
Mm-hmm. You know, that is kind of that's so interesting, because that person, when you're asking that question, it really speaks to this research work I'm doing with elders and knowledge keepers from across North and South America. They're called the Indigenous Timekeepers, and they have been meeting since before 2012. Because for many of you, you might be familiar with that 2012 was the end of the Bakhtun cycle, which was going to be the end of the world. But, you know, for people from the communities, we always understood, especially the Mayans, would explain that that calendar, the Bakhtun cycle, doesn't mean the end of the world, it means the end of a cycle. And so right now we're in this 13-year period where, according to their cosmology, the 4 trees that hold the earth up, one has fallen. That's what happens at the end of the Bakhtun cycle. And so our earth is kind of, our planet is off kilter. And it kind of, you know, when we think about this, it's like, yeah, when we see what's happened since 2012 to now, there's just so much. But in 2026, we will be entering into the new Bakhtun cycle, and they call that the new dawn. And so I'm explaining that because that tree is going to come back up. And this is why the timekeepers have been meeting since before 2012, because they are intent on bringing Indigenous knowledge forward for the benefit of everyone in the world. And so they are very much wanting to work with people like myself to help them create these digital bundles, to help them put those teachings out there. And so that's the kind of work that I've dedicated my life to, which is supporting elders and knowledge keepers to bring those teachings forward. And so when we talk about digital bundles, I just want to say that these digital bundles are, you know, expressed through many platforms. So we're looking at virtual reality. I just finished a short one for augmented reality on your telephone, right? So we have interactive documentary. We have pieces like 4 Directions, which is going to get a new site and get upgraded to HTML5 because it was built in Flash, which no longer exists. So it's a big question what this person is asking, because yeah, this is something that the community has been thinking about since the end of the Bakhtun and wanting to prepare for the new dawn. And so there is a process of people, and they're very committed in talking about building Indigenous knowledge houses across North and South America. And there are people who are meeting internationally with other Indigenous communities to talk about Indigenous knowledge houses. And again, these houses are for communities, but also for people who are committed to wanting to be allies and work and look at new paradigms for living and addressing and mitigating and helping with climate crisis, and trying to, you know, pull back from this constant, like, you know, this constant cult of the self and constant and endless consumerism. Yeah.
Right. Unfortunately, I think we're coming to the end of our allotted time, and there are still some questions that we are not able to get to. So I apologize to those who post the questions. But just a reminder, Dr. Wemigwans' books, it's called Digital Bundle, Promoting and Protecting Indigenous Knowledge Online. And again, I thank you sincerely for the very important work you do in reminding us that that we can take advantage of the different technologies, but think about it in ways that many of us have not thought about before, that we need to expand our view and our notion of genre and the signifiers, and how to navigate this space. And you're making important contribution and leading us navigate these very complex but enriching terrain. So thank you, Dr. Wemigwans, and thank you for all the audience who attended, and to the organizers and the people who supported this meeting. Thank you.
Miigwech.
Be back.